Yeah, who are you? Introduce yourself. Are you a CIA agent? Why do you hate China, etc.?
Cool. I mean, not cool, the CIA part, but yeah, I'm Promise. I'm a member of Lausan Collective. I'm currently based in the US.
Mhm.
And yeah, our group kind of formed last year, and as everybody knows, with all the kind of protests going on that's raging for last year, we formed last summer because a few of us kind of met online or just kind of knew each other from other activist spaces and stuff, and just thought we needed a kind of a left perspective on the Hong Kong movement. And this is, even before a lot of the tanky stuff, right? Like
Mhm.
hit the fan. But just trying to give a more nuanced perspective on what's going on in the movement, and things like that. I was a tenant organizer in LA Chinatown for a couple of years, and then now I'm based in the East Coast, and I'm doing most of my political work through Lausan.
Mhm.
And yeah, what else should I say? Yeah, I mean, my basics, I'll just, put my kind of cards open. Like our basic political position, or like my basic political position is, stressing the continuities between China and Western imperialism, right? In
Mhm.
terms of how it's not just a matter of like which one's worse or which one's bad, but how China and its governance of Hong Kong and how a lot of the kind of political infrastructure has been literally built off of kind of the colonial past, as
Yeah.
they're still kind of actively borrowing and taking a lot of these techniques. So I'll start with that.
Yeah. So is that also like the perspective that Lausan also operates from in general?
Yeah, I would say I think we try to keep it as open as possible, but as open to a bit more of a, we're not kind of
Mhm.
specifically anarchist or socialist or whatever, but then we have folks from these different milieux and stuff like that. I don't want to speak for the group or everyone,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it's a kind of principal opposition to obviously U.S. imperialism, but also holding China accountable, for the stuff, especially it's doing in Hong Kong, but also in the larger kind of geopolitical dynamic.
Yeah. So, what about like the protest movement and all of that? Could you like give us like a rundown of it? And also like, you and Lausan's like involvement? Like I assume you guys have people in Hong Kong who obviously must be involved and stuff like that. Like I don't know, like what do you think it's really kind of like what do you think it's kind of all about? I guess it's kind of hard to like pin anything down. I don't know. I
Mhm.
guess what do you think?
Yeah, 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 sure. Yeah, I mean, for security issues, I'm gonna be as vague
Yeah,
about the
no
details
worries.
of people and stuff like that, obviously. But like we started with obviously we do a lot of editorial stuff, right? In terms of I think translating, right, a lot of kind of stuff going on locally, right, that the
Mhm.
Western media like barely reports on, whether it's Tankies or CNN. And so just even giving the platform to the left is marginal in Hong Kong, and this is well known, and this is nothing to kind of sugarcoat. But like still, I think there's a lot of in terms of labor and feminist activists or all these sorts of things, right? I think we came together seeing how there are actually a lot of these voices who are kind of part of this large mass movement too, that yeah, most like all sides just don't pay attention to. And then obviously as leftists, in the city and out of the city, it's kind of a responsibility to kind of amplify those elements.
Mhm.
And yeah, so just I mean, quick rundown of I mean, yeah, I don't know how much history I should kind of give, but I guess the really brief overview is right. Like so, Hong Kong was under British rule. Before the British rule, it was a very small fishing port. And it was one of the things kind of negotiated to British rule after the kind of defeat of the Qing Empire. I don't want to dwell too much into
Mhm.
the 1800s, but it was returned to China and the Hanover in '97, and by the time it was returned, it was a kind of financial hub, and used this as kind of international finance capital, metropolitan city thing. And I think one important thing to note, I think this still kind of is not super intuitive for I think a lot of people in the West, is that the basic kind of political compass in the city that people think of isn't the left or right, isn't liberal or conservative. It's are you pro or against the government, right? And I
Mhm.
think obviously I think the thing people really need to understand is the fact that there are quote unquote left and right elements on both sides of the equation, and the or so-called actually let me rephrase that. The government kind of channels a kind of left rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
but like a lot of stuff they do is openly, obviously right wing, capitalists, and all these things. And obviously from the perspective of the movement, there are kind of really right wing xenophobic people, and then there's progressives and people who appeal to the U.S. and kind of a lot of different people from all walks of life possible, right? So I think that's a really important starting point. It's a really confusing starting point, but I think it's one that the Western audience kind of needs to kind of grapple with first, right, before they can simply kind of put these identity markers on whichever side of what's going on.
Definitely. I mean, it seems like I mean, ideologically, things are kind of a bit of a clusterfuck. I don't know, but one thing that I kind of noticed is that, like, I mean, for example, you have different businesses that take different sides. You have different unions that take different sides, stuff like that. And it seems like, I don't know, like at least in the official demands of the protests, like the goals mostly seem centered around the protests themselves, the 5 demands and stuff. Like half of them are like, just validate our protests. But I'm wondering, aside from that, like, what do you think is really behind the discontent? Like, are there material things that are behind it? Is it more than just like anti-pro-government sentiment?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one. I mean, I should kind of slowly lead up to this point, right? But I think one important demand, right, that's part of the 5 demands, but also is something that people have been advocating for a while is simply the right to vote, right? The simply right for universal suffrage, right? To actually be able to decide, who gets to be.
How does it work right now? It's like people can vote, but their vote is not. But their vote is like individuals voting is only worth like half the seats or less than half of the seats.
Yeah, right? Something like that, right? Yeah. So there's a thing called functional constituencies, right? Which is this highly complicated and elaborate way to prevent true democratic thinking in the city. But it's basically business interests, right? Who are kind of represented and really have the deciding vote for a lot of of half or more of the kind of legislative council. And then they try to do this thing where it seems kind of fair or reasonable, where it's like it's like representatives from each industry or something, right? But in reality, most of these seats are controlled by pro-Beijing elements. Even for example, like the labor seat, right, is by, and I'll go more into this later, is by like the pro-Beijing unions who consistently sell out kind of the workers and protect business interests and stuff like that.
Just on that point, I was actually reading about one of I think the biggest union in Hong Kong is against collective bargaining because they believe that there are harmonious relations between businesses and workers in Hong Kong. And when I read that, I was like, oh, I've been through this before, because Australia has a very similar sort of system, and that's where I'm from.
I mean,
class collaborationist sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just a brief overview. Yeah, there's 2 main kind of. I mean, they're not exactly unions; they're more like a coalition of unions, or like a kind of umbrella structure. It's Hong Kong. Very confusing names too, but Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions and Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, right? And the Federation one's the pro-Beijing one. The Confederation is the pro-opposition one. And there's like a host of different unions kind of under that umbrella, right? And I think just one short example would just give you the lay of the land. But yeah, besides the fact that you just gave, right? Like HKFTU has consistently opposed the right to collective bargaining. I mean, actually, just to backtrack, the right to collective bargaining only kind of came about in Hong Kong for actually only a matter of a couple months, right? So then you get these labor activists and politicians who kind of finally fought for this bill to be passed. This is still under colonial rule in Hong Kong, kind of like leading up to the handover in '97. And one of the first things, I always like to start with this when I talk to people about China, one of the first things that the Beijing government did when it kind of acquired Hong Kong back, reacquired Hong Kong, was to abolish that right to collective bargaining, right? So I mean, its cards are pretty clear, like literally right from the start. That's one of the first things abolished, right? And so people tried to keep bringing that back, but there wasn't enough kind of obviously all the tables kind of turned against them. And HKFTU, the unions have consistently lobbied to fight against this demand, right? And so one example I like to give is I have a friend in Hong Kong who is he was like a rank and file kind of truck driver under Vita Soy. I'm just drinking that right now. Just kind of terrible story, but yeah, he's a truck driver, and he delivers this, and it's like a huge company in Hong Kong, and and a big kind of corporation and stuff like that. And he's a truck driver. And yeah, he helped kind of, organize workers and launch a strike and stuff like that. And at the time, he was not like a leftist or anything. It was kind of like, job conditions are shitty, they're barely getting paid, and a lot of these things. And he said, like, this is already kind of commonish knowledge, right, among him and a lot of people who aren't really politicized, right, in the same way that, it's like, we know nothing about strikes. We want to do something against our bosses. Like, what should we do? And he already knew, right, from experiences. People told him, actually, HKFTU doesn't do shit. And that's not even the place. They literally just help, bring the workers and the bosses sometimes to the table and try to explain things in a way so that, it pacifies the workers without actually changing anything. Because HKCTU, he sees them on TV a lot, right? And that's, at least they do strikes or something. So he seeks out HKCTU, right? And they helped him out with the strike and blah 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 and things like that. But I think that's a really simple story to know about, what the reputations, I think, of these unions sometimes are, right, on the ground. Where, of course, HKCTU has a lot of issues, right, bureaucracy and top down, normal kind of union bullshit stuff, right? Yeah. But the fact that the alternative is so much worse and so much more kind of apolitical, depoliticized. I think that gives a good.
I've made videos and stuff on problems with unions in Australia. It sounds even worse. And in Australia, it's already pretty bad. I mean, in Australia, like, the unions are basically like a vehicle for one specific party. To do politics, and it sounds like there it's like it's like that, but just the unions do nothing instead of a little bit. So at least
the thing is they do nothing, but they have a strong political agenda, right? Like from the pro Beijing side, right? It's since the discourse is not usually about labor rights or something, right? It's like all these different formations in civil society in Hong Kong are tethered to this very fundamental binary, right? Which everyone thinks in, right? Of pro or against the government. And yeah, going back to kind of what you said earlier about what are the demands and stuff like that, and what this movement is kind of about. I think one thing I also want to kind of say, to give it more of a context, is so the traditional opposition, right, in Hong Kong, so-called pan-democrats, right, a lot of those people have been around, right, since before the handover. Like, they're kind of opposition politicians and stuff like that. Some were actually associated with the Communist Party before the handover and were disillusioned and became liberals, right? So they're kind of like the quintessential kind of like universal human rights liberals and stuff. But I think a really important element of this so-called more traditional pan-democratic opposition is their solidarity to Chinese dissidents in China, because so much of them have been politicized or energized, right, by the Tiananmen Square moment in 1989. And doing solidarity campaigns and other kind of subversive underground work, right, to try to get these people out or keep these people safe, and recognizing the kind of authoritarian government in the mainland. So that's been kind of the ideological center of the opposition for the longest time, right? And I think you have my generation and the generations below me, right, like the youth, the people in the 20s, saw how nothing has really helped, right? Like whatever opposition this is, like, things have not worked. Like, Chinese influence is getting stronger, the authoritarian repression is getting stronger. The thing that people don't really talk about, and I think that this is what makes leftists kind of like dismiss the movement, is obviously the material economic conditions, right? Like, things are just getting worse and worse. Like, more and more job precarity, people can't afford a house, loss of civil liberties, and all these things, right, are kind of wrapped up in this. So it creates this kind of atmosphere, right, of this kind of disillusionment, and people felt like the opposition has kind of it just hasn't worked, right? And I think that leads up to not only this moment, but the umbrella movement, right, where we see really a first wave of political engagement, really, from the youth for the first time. And this is really the kind of accumulation, or I mean, I don't want to say accumulation necessarily, but this is kind of like the big explosion, right, of a kind of insurgent youth repoliticized movement that has really started in the couple years around the umbrella movement. So that's kind of one way to explain, I think. And I think a part of this kind of upsurge, right, is tied to this increased kind of concentration on what it means to be a Hong Konger, right? What it means to engage in politics in Hong Kong in a really basic and simple level, right? And that has only magnified by the time you get to last year, where you get people, and there's this thing called localism, right? And there's all these different terminologies in this whole discourse, right? Which is not against the traditional opposition, but it definitely becomes this localism, this kind of centering on Hong Kong identity rather than this kind of cross-border element and stuff has definitely kind of taken mainstream really only in the last year, and it's been kind of a bubbling discourse, right, in Hong Kong civil society since the umbrella movement a couple of years back. So yeah.
So would you say, like, in terms of people being politicized, obviously, I mean, at least it seems to me like the main thing that people just want is, like, as you said, universal suffrage, like just a political system where instead of like businesses and unions having a disproportionate share of the vote, one person, one vote, basically, right?
Yeah, right. And I think, I think a big reason for why, well, actually, there are many reasons for this, right? But one of the reasons why it's so hard to, try to, like, you get Western leftists asking like why isn't there a coherent left in Hong Kong, or what does it mean to make things more leftist or something, right? I think how most of the city thinks now is not that, it's not like people are opposed to the left or they're opposed or they're championing the right or whatever, right? It's the fact that I think the general consensus is that there's literally no room to even sort out these ideological distinctions, right? And of course, coming from where we are in Lausan, there's, have a kind of, slightly different perspective on that, right? But so many people think that, we can't even talk about, what types of policies we want if we don't have something as simple as like the basic right to vote. When we have a system where like the government completely doesn't listen to the people, and that's completely unaccountable, right? Especially in light of the national security laws, there's no way to even talk about these ideological differences, right? And I think that's one thing that the left has to grapple with for real. What does it mean to practically think out of that kind of think with that mindset, right? And to be able to advance, radical kind of critiques of the system that go simply beyond the voting thing. And, one note I kind of want to touch on, right, that relates to all this confusion, right, is, and I think people ask this a lot, right? It's like, what do I think about the independence or separatism stuff, right, or self-determination? What do all these terms mean and stuff, right? And it's so easy for for the Beijing government, right, and tankies and other supporters of that government to be like, oh, these people are separatists, they're pro-independence, but actually in reality it's much more complicated than that, right? And there's a lot of materials, right, like going on debating what does self-determination mean, right, in a very unique situation, because most people aren't kind of naive enough to think this is just a simple national liberation project.
Hong Kong, right? Is, how could it be? I mean, Hong Kong without like China economically would probably collapse immediately, right? Like there needs to be good relations somehow. That's something that I thought about a lot. Like, maybe independence wouldn't even be practical, at least in the short term. Maybe just getting a better sort of political system at home would be a better short-term goal. And these people seem like, come conquer us again, Britain. And it's like, you guys are just making everyone else look bad. Have you even thought about how that would work?
But even even those people, right, it's like everyone's in this kind of general flux and discourse, right, of trying to navigate what self-determination means, right? And I think self-determination is such an attractive term for me, I think, to anchor our analysis, right? Because it gives a certain flexibility that's not tethered to ideas and discourses about the nation state or something, and we can't just plop
I mean, I think like the term self-determination isn't the same thing as independent. It's like the right to choose, basically. Like people can choose not to be independent if they don't want to be, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and I think the thing that's totally not decided is what does that mean, right? What does that government look like? What does that ideal even mean when we talk about Hong Kong in relation to China? What does that ideal self-determination mean when we talk about Hong Kong, vis-a-vis itself, right? Like the fact that it's such a cosmopolitan city, right? The fact that there's a huge swath of this kind of migrant domestic workers from Southeast Asia. Like, so are they Hong Kongers, or are mainland immigrants Hong Kongers? So I think you see this self-determination thing gets very, very complicated. And I actually think on the one hand it's precisely in that flux and that complexity where we see one of the more kind of redemptive moments of the movement, right? When you get Southeast migrant workers standing in solidarity with the movement. But then you also see the kind of ugly parts of this kind of insistence on like who counts, right? And the self-determination paradigm, right? Like I think obviously the kind of big elephant in the room is like mainland immigrants, right? Especially I mean, actually, the class element gets a little obscured, but yeah, mainland immigrants, right? Like, how they've been demonized in this movement, right? And how there's been this kind of how self-determination has been weaponized in a way, right, to exclude some of these people. I think that's a highly legitimate concern, and we're occupying a space in Hong Kong where all these different terms and who counts as what, right, and what types of model, I think is totally in flux. And I think activists, students and writers are figuring this out, and there's absolutely no coverage, right, of this in mainstream media, right? It's just like, oh yeah, they want freedom, or they want independence or something. Well,
they want freedom, they want USA, they want I
But
mean,
if you
it's
actually
basically like two like from what I see in the media at least, and this is good because this is what I want to talk about next, like the media stuff. You have like on one side you have like the mainstream Western media, which just like calls them pro-democracy protests, and basically just like they do a lot more of covering the repression than actually talking about what the people want in any sort of meaningful way. And then on the other side, you have people who are just like amplifying the stupidest elements of the protest and saying, this is what they are. Like every single person in the protest is like this. They're all racist. They're all fascists. They want Britain back. They hate China, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So it's very...
I mean, the thing is, on one hand, like it's reasonable to say that, people aren't actually interested in what people want, right? And these concrete elements. But other element, it's like, the people themselves don't really exactly know what they want, right? Or I mean, at least what the form of that want look like, right? And I think that's precisely the opening for the left, right?
Definitely.
Seize on the kind of democratic potentials of self-determination, of these kind of basic impulses, right, so-called to democracy or democratic ideals or something, and try to not only articulate a kind of critique, right, of liberal democracy, right, and how we can maximize this potential for democratic thinking, which to me is the essence of the left or something, right? But to give pragmatic options, right? Like, how do we relate to the unions? How do we relate to this so-called leaderless movement, right? What does it mean to talk about organization? What does it mean to resist against one of the largest superpowers and one of the most powerful surveillance states in the world, right? And I think there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of kind of ambiguities, right? That not only like Western Chinese media aren't able and won't want to capture, right? But the fact is, everyone on the ground is still figuring out these questions, and it's exciting, and it's also terrible and terrifying in its own way. But that's how most mass movements work, and I think most organizers would sympathize and understand that sentiment, right?
I think it definitely, like the kind of immaturity of the movement definitely came across in, as I said earlier, like the 5 demands initially. Like I don't remember exactly what they were, but I think like 3 or 4 of them were just about the protests themselves, not actually asking for any change. And I even made a video at the time being like, oh my god, this is so stupid. But so what you're telling me really helps put that in perspective. People are just kind of being politically engaged for the first time. So they don't really know what they want.
I'll add one point to the kind of like the minimalism of the 5 demands, right? I think this actually goes back to the umbrella movement in 2014. Actually, there was a lot of ideological discussions and debates, right? This is where like the left wasn't marginalized yet, and there were kind of this is actually, the umbrella movement happened just a couple of years after one of the largest workers' dock strike, and leftists and students, like there was actually a moment, right, for the left, and the right was still kind of congealing themselves, and people were just starting to rethink what independence means and stuff. So the umbrella movement was a total kind of open, there were literal, I know leftist friends who they just pulled out their own soapboxes, when people were occupying Central and just promoting their platform, where they're like fighting against that right-wing guy, in the other soapbox or something, right? And it's totally chaotic. And the thing is, that movement failed in 2014, and a lot of people were basically
what was the goal of the umbrella movement?
Yeah, so there's this Article 23 thing, the basic law. It was, again, kind of, actually, it was an even larger law in terms of like, it's like delaying the kind of universal suffrage part, and people felt like it was another kind of big move, right, to kind of delay or deny Hong Kongers like a kind of basic, it's always like it starts with something particular, right, and the movement kind of coalesces around and turns into this kind of a more universal, a more kind of a larger movement, right, about the kind of soul or whatever, democratic soul of Hong Kong or whatever, right? It turns into this huge kind of complicated thing where everyone has their own kind of perspectives and around some sort of minimum platform. But yeah, I think what happened in the umbrella movement, or the failure of which, right, like it kind of fizzled out, and was the fact that people felt like there were too much infighting, right? people felt like, why the fuck are we arguing about ideology and what type of system we want when, you know, things are just getting shittier year by year, right? And that was really, and so the no platform 5 demands thing, what was actually, you know, more deliberate than people think. It's basically a consensus between a lot of the people who've been around the movement a lot to be like, no, we can't, we're not going to kind of kill ourselves over, you know, what strategy or what tactic to do next or something. We need as minimum of a platform as possible.
Yeah.
And that's the only way we can win anything, right, in this political climate. So that's really the kind of backstory, I think, of 5 demands. Like, we can agree and disagree with how bare bones with it. But
yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, just from what you said, I mean, and what's happened since, I mean, aside from the retraction of the extradition bill, basically nothing has happened. It's actually, seems to me, it's gotten worse. So maybe that makes sense, and not really ask for too much, because I don't know. It seems like, I don't know, like, I think on the surface level, like just universal suffrage in Hong Kong on by itself wouldn't really threaten China very much at all. But what it would mean, like, it might give ideas to other parts of China.
Right.
And that's probably what they're scared of. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. No, I completely agree with that. Actually, I don't know if I should be on record. Yeah, no, it's just no. Like, I mean, I actually have written about this, so it's, you know, I'm fucked already. But like, it's. Are you
allowed to like enter Hong Kong? Like, is that a thing that you're allowed to do with the stuff that you do online? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I can't believe I'm publicly saying this. Yeah, I don't know. I'll figure this out. I'm still browsing, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the awkward part of the activism is the stakes are so high, I think, when you tap into this international arena and things like that. But yeah, what I was going to say is, yeah, that's totally right. Like what we just said about you know, this kind of potential of sparking other like-minded types of movements in China, right? Because, you know, there are these myths that Beijing government likes to promote, right? I mean, they're not myths, but, you know, they're always like, you know, framing facts in a kind of alternative way, right? That makes them look better, right? I think one of those biggest facts that tankies love to kind of jump on is like, you know, it's like, look, everyone's massively satisfied with the government, right? It's like something like China has one of the highest approval government support ratings or something in the world or something. But what people don't actually look at is actually, if you look down to the local level or even provincial level, those support levels, you know, sharply drop really quickly, like the more local you go. And that's a pretty unique phenomenon just in world politics. But also, you know, that shows, you know, there have been scholars speculating that's a deliberate strategy, right? Like ideologically of channeling dissent, right? To, you know, it's always, oh no, it's that local official's fucked up, right?
Yeah, they did the same thing in Wuhan, didn't they, recently?
Right. Yeah, it's channeling a lot of the rage to the local officials, right? But like, no, but you can't, it's not the national government's fault, right? And I think the nationalism has been such a big project and initiative, right? By the and that's been totally weaponized by the Chinese government, both to influence public sentiment in mainland and in Hong Kong against the movement, and also in the diaspora, right? And it's this kind of weaponizing of this kind of Western imperial trauma of like, you know, it's like we were oppressed by the British for so long, and look at these flags now that these people are waving, and just totally weaponizing that, right? And turning this into a, you know, actually no, these are all just, you know, Yankee sympathizing fascists or something, and riling up public sentiment, right? In a way that coalesces people together and be like, no, actually a lot of people have dissent, right? Especially locally. But no, like in the face of this larger national threat, like the security issue, right? Security is such a big word. Yeah, like we need to, no, this is bad, you know, like this is not even about like whether people are satisfied with the government or not. This is about like a national security threat. And that rhetoric has just been so effective. Yeah, and it's something I think actually abroad and in the diaspora is the place that kind of where we have the political space, right, to really push back against this monopolization of the Chinese identity, this weaponizing of nationalism from China. So, and obviously it doesn't halt, right, with the Hong Kong movement, you know.
I mean, the way that you describe it, I mean, sounds like basically a lot of or even most of like the like colonial structure from the British is still intact in Hong Kong.
Yeah,
pretty much. I mean, the political system is basically the same. The laws are basically the same.
Exactly. Yeah.
I also read an article that you guys, or someone from you guys wrote about how the police force is basically the exact same. It's still the British one, you know.
Yeah.
Stuff
quite
like
literally
that.
British police officers,
British British trained cops who are also trained by the USA, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I mean,
U.S. trained cops and then British high-ranking police officers. Yeah, so
I mean,
it's pretty
functionally after the
like,
handover, like what actually changed? That's what I'm wondering. Like, what changed? Doesn't
yeah.
really seem like much.
It's a flag change, right? Essentially,
Yeah.
to taking a flag, and yeah. I mean, I was gonna go back to this is related to the electoral system thing, right? But one of the big kind of pro-Beijing figures, Regina Ip, right? She wrote this very, very tasteful and timely article titled "Why Hong Kong Does Not Need More Democracy," just a couple months ago, in like in the wake of national security laws. Very, 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 very tone deaf. But yeah, she pointed out, and she made this kind of amazingly kind of inane, ridiculous point where she was like, actually, China never broke the trust of the Hong Kong people about guaranteeing democracy, because that one was actually really guaranteed in the Sino-British Declaration in the 80s, which is kind of like it's like a kind of ridiculous self-own where it's like, wait, no, so it's like, actually, we weren't unaccountable people because we never promised it to begin with, and it's this kind of ridiculous thing where it's actually like, no, it's this lack of democracy, right? This constraining of democratic potential were things that were negotiated, right? A lot of it was negotiated in the years between 80s and 90s. A lot of stuff were explicitly kept, right? Like Hong Kong's status as a kind of global financial hub, global status of, Hong Kong's status of retaining all these kind of structural exploitative measures and stuff. People forget that, you get these people trying to be like, the British did this and China's trying to recover it. No, it's literally called the Sino-British Declaration, and
Yeah,
there was thought put into this, and there's a reason why Hong Kong was kept the way it was, and amplified, in fact, the colonial elements.
Yeah, I mean, something that I was reading about recently is how basically even China under Mao, for example, considered Hong Kong's status under the British to be very advantageous because they could in terms of trade, they could just ship stuff to Hong Kong, and then the British or other people would have to take charge of it for the rest of the way. So it was like such a huge advantage for them. And it seems to me like, I mean, same sort of thing is continuing now. For example, I don't know, like I'm against sanctions, for example, but you have the US. I'm against pretty much all sanctions in general, but you have the US, for example, removing Hong Kong's special status or whatever and considering it a part of China. Seems to me like that would really hurt them. I mean, it would also really hurt Hong Kong, but just like like an example of how things kind of remain the same. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party ever wanted to actually challenge the status quo in Hong Kong. Like they just wanted to let the lease expire and do it that way, So for people to frame it as like an anti-colonial struggle is kind of rich, at least in my mind.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a little too, but definitely, I think the point is to preserve the status quo, right? And it's only recently they learned to kind of adopt this anti-imperial rhetoric or something, right? To sugarcoat the fact that they've been totally in bed with I mean, the simple kind of blatant obvious fact is, for example, the fact that China has super exploited its own working class population. I mean, that's literally, China's economic growth is built off of,
and Hong Kong is like just as bad, if not worse, right? Because I mean, there's less space.
It's not just super exploiting its own workers; it's super exploiting workers for the West, right? It's for cheap commodities that we use. There's always this joke about your iPhone being made by underpaid Chinese workers. It's like, that's as imperial or colonial as you get, and that's that came out of an agreement, right, with the Chinese government and all these different corporations and US governments. And just to keep pointing out stuff, right, about this how China has built off of these colonial measures. The thing I was talking about, right, the functional constituencies, this really elaborate way to kind of get just to not have democracy, right, is to protect these business interests. That was from the colonial period. Like that was quite literally by the British, and they just took it. And so you see these tankies, like these pro-Beijing people just like defending. It's like, no, actually it's pretty democratic. Like, no, like let me explain it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at it, and in the last big election in 2016, I think it was something like from the like one, the general population vote, the so-called pro-democracy camp won by a smallish margin. But in the functional constituencies, the pro-China camp won like 80% of the seats.
Yeah, it's obviously.
So it seems like they're basically being propped up by businesses and like interest groups voting for them.
I mean, there's this one other guy. I was just kind of looking into this. He's like part of the, I forgot what it's like. It's kind of like the rural functional constituencies. Like
there's rural.
tourists or something.
There's
He's like
rural
literally
stuff in Hong Kong that
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
completely
they're like
ignorant
in the new territories, they're a bit more rural areas and stuff like that. Yeah, but he's like this giant landlord, and he owns like hundreds of pieces of land. He's just like he just literally gets reelected every single time for like 4 decades or something.
It
And then
seems like
guess
he's
what? He
voting for
dies.
himself.
Yeah, he dies and his son takes over that the chair of that function. So it's just like that's just like I really don't understand what the like how blatant, right, it can get. And, and his son also owns like a bunch of like polo clubs and like just like social club things and 400 pieces of land. So these are the people, right that are dictating policy, right, in
It's
Hong Kong.
like,
And
it's like it's like hundreds of thousands of other people vote for one seat, but this one guy votes for an entire seat himself or something like that. It's so ridiculous. Oh man.
Right.
It's a really weird political system. It's like it's like trying to mask what it really is, but it does such a terrible job of it. I don't know.
Yeah, it does a pretty terrible job of it. I mean, but I mean, the thing is, rhetorically, it's been working. Like right? Like there are pro-Beijing sentiments everywhere.
Well, I
mean,
but before we started, like I sent you an article of like a poll that said like
right, yeah,
60%. So support for the protests, like the protests in the actual physical protest, has been dropping. I think that might be related to the pandemic, but we can say maybe in general too. But paradoxically, support for pro-democracy measures and against a lot of the things that the protests are against has been going up. It says, for example, the poll found that nearly 60% of people were opposed to the security law, up from 57% in the previous survey in June. But the support for the protest went down from 51 to 44%. So what's going on there?
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting article. Yeah, I think definitely the pandemic has stuff to do with it, and also like the fatigue, I think, right? And people
it's been like almost 2 years, hasn't it?
It's been a little more than a year, yeah, but it's a lot. It's I wasn't there obviously the whole year and stuff like that. I've only went back much more intermittently, but like the pace of life in the city is incredible. It's people are just totally politicized in new ways where every weekend is a protest, and every weekend you don't know if you're going to go out and be arrested, right? And just imagine being in that mindset for a year. It's exhausting, and it's work like insane amount of hours and stuff like that, and they're super newly politically charged, and you get these kids who are supposed to, you have to go to school, or even people who aren't involved in the movement, right? It's like you don't know if you're going to get tear gassed every, there are a lot of these stories of like people just getting gassed, like just cops throwing random tear gas bombs like in residential areas. And so you get like kids suffocating in like an elevator or something. So it's like after a year of this kind of attrition, I think people are kind of tired. And I think the national security laws is a big breaking point, right? Where things have not been that bad ever in the city. And people are trying to reevaluate what security protocols can look like, what we can say or not say. This kind of putting bodies on the front lines again and again for a whole year, does that even work anymore? Because then you get people getting arrested now for subverting national security for just having a sticker or something, right? So it's like what is it even, like at a certain point you can at least rally for like like half an hour, and like as time goes on it's like 15 minutes before the cops start coming in. And then now it's like, wait, can you even be, I have a friend who was arrested just for having some object thing.
There were some photos from like the first days after the law of like cops holding up a banner saying in like 3 different languages, you are holding up illegal slogans, please go home now, we will be forced to arrest you. And it's like, wow, that's interesting. So imagine if that happened anywhere else, what the people who are against the protests in Hong Kong would say.
Yeah. So it's I think since July it's been a lot of just kind of reflection, trying to be safe, trying to know what it means to be safe in a new way, recalibrating, and obviously them using this moment to arrest people, right, and to just literally deal with arrests, right? It's like, how do we try to support fellow comrades or something, right? Because you're like losing people left and right. And so I think that's really, I mean, it's really sad. It's kind of where we are. I think obviously I think our job being in the left is to keep being tethered to the movement and trying to keep exploring. But
it seems to me like something's like I mean, obviously, China is good at realpolitik. They're not going to do a new Tiananmen Square unless they think it would be good for them, and I don't think they think it would be good for them.
Yeah, that would
That's
not
probably
be,
the only thing that's probably the only thing that's stopping them. But like, looking at this poll, it's like, support for universal suffrage, for example, it has been really high the entire time, above 60%. This one says 63%, stuff like that. When most of the population is in favor of something, it's like, how long can they possibly delay it? I don't know. Do you think like it's going to happen eventually, anytime soon? Are they going to, basically keep cracking down on it and just hope people forget? Like, I don't know. For me, it seems it's really hard to predict how this is actually going to go.
Yeah. No, it is really hard. Yeah. And again, it's like the, we're dealing with a very new type of regime, that people are still trying to figure out. You get scholars, right? You're even trying to argue basic questions like, is China a capitalist, or what kind of capitalist it is, right? What kind of system of governance it has, right? So in a sense, we can always say like, if you read history, you know that, I'm sure there's quotes about this or something, right? It's like not every moment's not that exceptional as you think. But in this moment, yeah, I genuinely don't know. I think what we can do, especially on the outside, is to keep supporting and keep reading and keep listening to the folks on the ground, or the folks who are left, who still can publish at all or something, let alone kind of let alone organize, right? And just to, for example, I always go into this, right? In every talk I give is the fact that, this movement has also seen one of the biggest unionization upsurges in the history of Hong Kong, as far as I know, right?
Have they been mostly joining the good unions or the bad unions? I mean,
the good unions, yeah. No, but the difference here isn't actually, it's not about like, for some reason, HKCTU, right, like the established pro-democracy union, was suddenly really good at organizing. It was literally just like people organically like, oh, there's this thing called unions, and we'll all just join it. And so,
I mean, I've also seen some things lately that
trying to like make sense of. Yeah, there's just like HKC trying to make sense of like, wait, what do we do with this random influx of people that we never had, right? Or just people going to unions, like how can we capture this energy? Because they never had to deal with a situation like that. And so yeah, you get like literally like, actually these, I was gonna say this as a hopeful point, but like, like these unions are still going on, right? Like they're still, I mean, they're technically not censured exactly yet, right? Because they're supposed to be kind of just talk about workplace issues or something in a general sense. But yeah, there's been over 60, 70 different sectors, right? That's never unionized, right? Dental equipment producers. There's like one specifically for H&M workers. There's one specifically for dancers. It's for construction.
It seems really weird that, sorry, just to interrupt you. It seems really weird, like what you just said, like there's unions, but they're technically not allowed to do anything, right? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah, or I mean, you don't know what the...
I mean, they might be doing stuff like informally, but technically they're not supposed to, right? They're not supposed to like actually be doing workplace organizing and stuff. They're not actually supposed to be negotiating with employers, anything like that, right?
Yeah, well, it depends on what those things are. Yeah, I mean, I think again, the point of national security laws is that you don't know what is actually illegal, right? Because the point is,
to be very
now
vague.
The final jurisdiction or decision over these cases are decided solely by Beijing and their appointed officials. Like for the most part, you can't even have lawyers and stuff like that. So right now it's literally just like, a lot of people on the ground are just like, some people who are a little bit braver would just be kind of like, fuck it, and try to push boundaries a bit. And others are just gonna lay low for a bit, right? Because there's honestly, you don't know what would constitute as subverting national security by this point. Like I'm up here saying I'm not for independence or succession, obviously, but like, I don't know, like maybe because I said self-determination, that's also independence. Like that's not up to me anymore. So it's like, what does organizing even look like in that sense, right? And I think this is precisely the moment people
it's
are
like you don't actually know what you can say. Even if you're not technically against the things that those laws are supposed to be for, they could still hit you with them. So
my favorite example is still like, I mean, not my favorite, it's just like, it's terrible, but like it's I think this is one of the early days of the national security law where some guy got pulled over for, I mean, we know this because the cops posted what they confiscated, and then one of the things was
they tweet, don't they?
They sent us a sticker that just said conscience in Chinese, and they're like, what? So I can't, like, why is that subverting that? It's like, what counts as subversion at this point? I think that so it's just, there's these meaningless things. I mean, for example, like 6 people gathering in a shopping mall to raise an empty placard. Like the cops came after them. They told them to leave, and like 5 minutes we're going to arrest you. And you're
well,
like, what's
at least you just told them to leave. And I also saw recently another thing, like there was like attacks in a subway, I believe, last year. Right wingers or like pro-China people, like pro-China vigilantes or triads or whatever. I don't know if they're actually triads, but like attacking people. And now somehow they're charging the people who were attacked for being attacked and saying that they were actually the attackers. Do you know about that?
I do know about that. I don't even want to read too deeply into that because I don't even know how to.
I know, it's just
that guy was literally bleeding. Like there's pictures of him being attacked.
Oh wait, so the guy in that video, he's the one who's being charged. I didn't actually get that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the guy who's being charged now for I don't even know what now, right? By this point, and he was like, there's footages of him trying to ask the cops for help or just like being attacked like physically, like he's had like injuries. Like I don't know what I really don't know what the right. So somehow that's framed as subverting national security as the guy being attacked. So it's I really don't know what to say at this point. Yeah.
So where do we even go with that? Just a great example of how incredibly weird that is. From what I also read, the national security law is technically extraterritorial. So if China got mad at me, they could put an arrest warrant out for me, even though I've never been there. So
yeah. If you step foot back in Chinese territories, like you can be, I guess, detained or something. Yeah. But I think, actually, I think it's more specifically for, people like Hong Kong permanent residents. So like as a permanent resident, like just if you're born there, you're a permanent resident. So if say you're a Hong Konger who's born there and immigrated, and you got charged with something, which has happened already, actually, right? Like China has charged this American activist who has been. He was born in Hong Kong, but he's been living here for like a couple decades, and just saying he can't go back to Hong Kong now, or else he'll be kind of arrested on site. So there's that. Yeah,
I mean,
the jurisdiction's getting a little blurry, definitely. Yeah.
I was about to ask something, I forgot what it was, but anyway. None of the topic that I wanted to cover, just to change the subject quite a lot. So like the initial Hong Kong coverage, it was like all over the media, basically, all over the Western media. Everyone, look at this, look at this, look at this. It was happening like in the midst of like a lot of other protests around the world, especially in like Iraq, Lebanon, Ecuador, Chile, all these different places. And my initial impression, honestly, was like, fuck this, fuck this. I don't care about this. Why aren't they talking about anything else? And it kind of really I don't know, in a way, like it had like the opposite intended effect on me. Like, the intended effect obviously is to cover for those protests that are less convenient for, the narrative of these media outlets. But it had like the effect of me almost like just saying fuck Hong Kong a little bit.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, I feel like Western media, in a huge way, kind of does a disservice to what you guys actually, your struggle, like what you actually want, because they don't actually, they kind of just use it as a convenient cover. And I mean, you can also talk about like in general, like the way that the US basically takes advantage of the protests, Europe takes advantage of the protests. So what do you think?
For anti-China purposes, yeah, definitely. No, I think it's absolutely right. Media coverage is totally and blatantly skewed, and it's covered disproportionately to other really important struggles too, right? From all the places you're talking about, Lebanon, Chile, Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, right? That's heated off right pretty quickly after the initial month.
I actually made a point. I made a video in like last October. It's almost a year ago, Jesus. And I made a point where I said I'm all for what these people in Hong Kong are protesting for, but I'm telling you, when there's a big BLM moment in the US, the same people who are cheering them are going to be calling for blood, and that's exactly what happened.
Exactly what happened. Yeah, you got you got these Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, and stuff. They're two-faced. I mean, I call them all sorts of names. I don't need to hurt people now, but yeah, that's just. I think so. I think Lausans Goal isn't. So we recognize this imbalance, right, in media, right, and so it's like a big part of. Again, I don't want to speak too much for a group, but like at least how I'm approaching my role as an activist in the diaspora, right, who's also situated in the middle of all these struggles, is the fact that we're not trying to say like we need to prioritize this over the other, or like, no, look at us, Hong Kong or something, and pay more attention to us than other people. It's more about, well, right, looking at the world as kind of, totally interconnected, right? Global capital is totally interconnected, right? You get systems of governments learning and borrowing, and literally borrowing from each other in terms of policing methods, in terms of the economy, right? In terms of trade and things like that. And it's more about articulating the connections between mass movements, right? How we can articulate the shortcomings of the movement in relation, right, to like I think that's why, like me and another kind of friend wrote a piece connecting the Black Lives Matter protests to the Hong Kong protests, not to flatten them. Obviously, it's like, no, we're not going to compare like Hong Kongers, like, year-long struggle to like, slavery or black, it's like, obviously that's not the point. But the point is, what does it mean to talk about these systems of governance in a larger sense? Like, what does it mean that China is adopting American policing methods, right? Literal American surveillance companies, right? Like, these are methods or companies and weapons that are built off of right, state governments suppressing black resistance, right? And they're doing it ongoing in a way now, right? And what does it mean that you get people here who are trying to look to the methods and stuff, or street tactics of people in Hong Kong? And what does it mean to talk about these connections in a way that doesn't flatten them, right? But to provide solidarity, and to, I think, honestly, I have to say, like the Black Lives Matter movement have given us, at least me, a lot of encouragement and hope in terms of actually trying to influence the discourse on the ground in Hong Kong, right? Because this is such a big, like, people don't know what to do with it in Hong Kong, I think, for a while, because it's like, so much of the strategy has been to appeal to US senators, right? And suddenly you get this movement that looks strikingly,
and the same US senators don't give a shit.
Yeah, and people are, I know a lot of people are sympathetic, right? And then, but you're like, what do you actually do about that, right?
Yeah,
you get some people who are like, okay, yeah, no, those protests are right, but
there's
like,
a lot of similarities there in terms of, like, for example, like, as I was talking about a second ago, like, the approval of the goals of the protests in Hong Kong are really high, and at least in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, like, the approval of Black Lives Matter in the US was like 70% or something like that, and it was like, wow, that is incredible. Right. I couldn't have imagined that. I mean, obviously everything changed very fast there, but it's like, and it's like, it's like a huge moment where big stuff can happen. I don't know. I feel like in the US, still nothing has really happened. People are just putting all their cards into, like, voting for Joe Biden and hoping that fixes everything. So
I mean, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff going on the ground. I think especially locally, right? I mean, we could talk about, for example, Minneapolis or something, right? It's like they're one of the first that supposedly abolished their police department, right? But it's obvious. Obviously, there are a lot of setbacks now and reforms and stuff, but we can't, I think the fact that even happened, right, was the product. And I think this is a point that Robin Kelly and other, Black activists have made already. This is a product of a lot of political education, a lot of organizing behind the scenes, right, that have been, this doesn't just kind of happen because of George Floyd, right? It's a lot of organizing, a lot of activists, a lot of groundwork already. And I think I see a similar kind of inspiration of local activism coming from this moment that's re-energizing a lot of local groups in a way where, obviously, get this kind of seemingly big existential threat of like Biden versus Trump, but like still, I think the energy is definitely in coming into a lot of the local work, right? Like, I was just at a rally in Chinatown talking about where these really amazing organizers are talking about canceling rent and trying to delay people trying to restore this eviction thing, right? And you get Black we're protesting from the city hall, and then Black activists coming out to support because they were already there, kind of chilling and occupying in Grand Park.
So has all this kind of been like enabled by basically the whole sort of movement there?
Right, and at the same time, it also, again, like going back to my point just now, it really it gives a lot for the people in Hong Kong to think about, right? I think you can tell by the, I mean, it's like when I think I posted that article on Hong Kong and Black Lives Matter, and I get reactions from all across the political spectrum, right? It's like people, it's like, how dare you compare these two movements, or how dare you bring up Black Lives Matter? They're rowdy and they're not like Hong Kong at all. So it's like from all across the spectrum, right? But I think that's precisely interesting, right? Because there's never been that type of debate, I feel like, in the movement, because like people don't know what to do with it. Some people are sympathetic, some people are not. And what does it mean to to use this as a way to, what does it mean for Hong Kongers and we're just even Asian Americans to show support for Black lives, right, in a way? And how does that reframe the way we think about our own activism and politics, right? Not only as an Asian American activist here, but as a Hong Konger who sees the
Mm-hmm.
similarities between these movements or in terms of tactics and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that going back to my point, I think the point is trying to offer solidarity and learn from each other without necessarily throwing movements under the bus, right? Because that's so much of this kind of super pro, this binary rhetoric, right, that the Western left falls into, is that like, you're not talking enough about Lebanon, right? So obviously this other movement sucks or something.
Yeah.
But but actually it's about how do you come from your positionality, right, and make these connections as activists and organizers across borders. I think, and recognizing, right, the privileges, right, of certain movements over others, or the extent of the trauma and how that's different for different movements with different contexts, and making connections, right. And I think that's really the way forward in our very kind of globalized economy where state repression is indeed very globalized and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about that and linking it back to the electoral system and everything, like a part of the reason why, for example, Chilean social movements are so strong is because they've done the electoral struggle 100 times before, and it feels like in Hong Kong people haven't even had that opportunity, like they're like, it almost feels like electoral politics there kind of sound depoliticized a little bit until very recently. Like, I don't know.
It seems like actually in a weird way, it feels like people only see the, because there's still a legislative council since the Hanover, like people were still elected to that. Like it wasn't really until last, like literally 4 years where people were literally getting disbarred, right? And then the legislative council is becoming this straight up, it's like a pro-Beijing space. Like before that point, like, like pan-democratic politicians can actually get elected in, right? It's just like, you just can't really do that much in this space, right? And there isn't really that history of social movement building, I think, in the same way, right? Of what it means to, join unions and build an organization and stuff, right? Like in Hong Kong, what happens is that there's a lot of political parties, right? Like before this point. But like, there are a lot of parties with like 10 people and they formed just because they wanted to do this one election or something. And most of them were like extremely ideologically unclear, and they're more just like kind of contingent alliances and stuff like that to like get people into the legislative council. And I actually think, like, well, one, like that has rapidly become less of an arena struggle based on how things go. And I think people are trying to find alternatives to the legislative council. And I think that's actually one thing that hasn't really quite happened in a kind of mass movement way, I would say. Because it's so for so many people that really, I mean, you could already tell, right, by this kind of obsession with the right to vote, right? It's like the electoral scene is really seen as, like we can, I talk about this with like more liberal centrist Hong Kong friends. It's like, you can shit on America all you want, but like at least you guys can vote, right? Because so much of it just comes back to that point. And you can explain it as like, no, it's gerrymandering, and like indigenous oppression, and you're like, no, this is all fucks and stuff. But it's like the imagery, right, of the fact that you could literally just vote, right? Like I think it's so not there. And
I mean, like even the illusion of democracy is useful for organizing, because it
right.
People, it makes people believe that this is how they engage with politics, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of engage with them as well. It's like what you said about the unions as well. Like the unions, they're kind of a bullshit illusion, but people are joining them, and that gives you an opportunity to reach them.
Exactly. Yeah, it gives you a way to, you could talk about, for example, we did so like Lausan did a kind of a webinar with medical workers, where we're connecting the medical, like, these medical workers that newly unionized in Hong Kong with, some of our friends we know from like SCIU and National Nurses United and stuff like that, just to do an exchange talking about like, what is it like organizing? Well, what is it like organizing during COVID? And then what is it like organizing in the backdrop of other social movements, right? Like mass movements going on, right? Like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter here, and then the Hong Kong movement there. And there's a lot of productive, for example, like I think it was me or someone else who brought up, like rank and file strategy, or like Jane McAlevey or like Kim Moody. It's just like, okay, what it means to be in a union, what do you mean to talk about bottom up change and things like that. And then the Hong Kong organizers are like, wait, that sounds like super interesting. Like, like just send me stuff, And honestly, like that's way. I mean, I'm just gonna say that's way more useful, right, than any U.S. sanctions, which are generally. Not. I mean, useful is not even like, it's like destructive for the most part, right? And
I mean, a U.S. sanction is just gonna like, I mean, the entire, I'm sure but the entire goal of sanctions is just to make people suffer and make them like turn against the government. So it's not exactly a productive way to go about it.
Yeah, and you see it very, very destructively, right? In places like Iran. where now you get like, it's like basic medical
Yeah,
supplies
I
or
was just
something.
reading a thread on Twitter of a guy whose father died because of shortages caused by sanctions.
Exactly.
So
Right.
yeah,
Like, so that's it gives, I think for Hong Kongers who don't know the history and the context of these US sanctions, it seems to give this illusion of like, it's like a quick solution, right? Like this can speed things
yeah,
up
but
and
I
this gives an
mean,
easy answer.
well,
But yeah,
maybe they need a little bit of a reality check because I don't think they'd like it in practice.
yeah.
Mm,
So I think the left is, again, I keep going back to this point. The left, I think the role of the left isn't necessarily to like spend our whole time trashing. It's like we can spend our time trashing Hong Kongers. Like I can trash my own friends for supporting the Hong Kong Human Rights Act because I don't like it. But like, is that really how? I mean, I think like at the end of the day, we're trying to build a movement, right? We're trying to win
yeah, no
liberation,
doubt.
and simply focusing on how shitty things are or something or why they made mistakes, I think is not enough. I
Yeah,
think the left needs to provide concrete alternatives. And right now we're fighting to even have a voice to even talk about Hong Kong, let alone talk about alternatives
yeah. It
that we
almost
can
seems like
do.
in the short term now, like the goal is kind of shifting to just be able to even talk about these things rather than
Right.
actually doing like getting
Yeah.
the universal suffrage and stuff. It's I don't know.
Exactly.
It'll be interesting to see where things are at in a year from my perspective as someone who's not affected by this at all. But for you, it'll be
Yes.
like
Yeah.
it'll be a lot more serious.
I,
I
I'm
know. I
I'm
mean,
curious too.
another thing that I wanted to ask is like,
Right.
just like even aside from like the political system and stuff like that, Hong Kong is very well known as like one of the the greatest example of how, or probably the greatest example of how an incredibly developed sort of city state, incredibly rich, and still has like a massive underclass of people basically living in
Right.
shoeboxes and stuff like that.
Right.
So, could you like go into that a little bit? Like, what do you think? I don't know. Like, how is the situation if like the working class? How could it be improved? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those are big questions. But yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a huge working class that doesn't think of itself as such, right? I think that's
Mm-hmm.
one thing to point out, right? I think it's one of the most inequitable cities in the world, thanks to not just the West but also China, right? Who maintained the system, as I said earlier. But yeah, I think there's been so much work even from, and this is another thing I think China found useful and took up, right? Is this consistent squashing of social movements before they can even begin, right? And this goes
Mm-hmm.
all the way back to British colonial rule, right? In the wake of the, like one of the biggest kind of upsurges was like the 1967 riots, right, in Hong Kong. But after that, right, like activists have been kind of attacked at every point, right? Like movements literally can't grow. Like there's literally a break from there's no organized left party. There's no organized left
Mm-hmm.
organization. Like it's hard to know what that means, and so much of emphasizing the precarity of the conditions of people, like taking away job benefits and stuff. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this goes through a little bit of a same, right, in certain parts of China too, where now you created a system and a culture, right, where yeah, like it's not even like social movement building is discouraged. Is that they've been so thoroughly repressed, right? Where even if you
Mm-hmm.
want to change stuff, is like there's no like quote unquote indigenous or local tradition of what it means to go to a thing, right?
Yeah.
Besides, like there's vaguely a HKCTU like thing, right? There's like a union. We're like, what does that mean? What does it actually do? And at the end of the day, like for example, yeah, like there are a lot of union bureaucracy, and there's a lot of issues, right, with these things, and that demoralizes people. So then this creates a culture where it's like life is just shitty, and you can't really. You just gotta stick with it,
Mm-hmm.
or you gotta like climb up the social ladder or something,
Yeah.
because there's literally no alternatives that people can look
Are
to,
there
right?
like
There's
actually
no
like
yeah.
sort of like liberal sort of social programs there in Hong Kong, like anything at all or anything
Yeah, I
like
mean, there's
that?
like social work, right? They're like civil society groups, right? They're
No,
like
I mean like
it's like
like welfare and healthcare and stuff like that.
yeah. I mean, so in some ways it's better than what we have here, but in other ways it's also it's
Mm-hmm.
also a system that's getting rapidly kind of it's very precarious and defunded and stuff, right? Like for example, like mental health resources, a lot of basic medical care stuff. It's super privatized, and for like hospital, certain parts that are better in the U.S. and like public hospitals and stuff are better, but like but yeah, like there's a lot of these things that are getting rapidly funded, and for example, like social workers or something, right? It's like it's just, if you
Yeah.
want like some sort of a government therapy, like that's not gonna
Yeah,
happen.
and this is being done by like a pro-China government, right? So it's like a bit of
Yeah,
a
right.
paradox there because you have the Chinese Communist Party, which kind of sells itself as, you know,
Right.
actively doing stuff for people. But in Hong Kong, you know, seems like they don't really
I mean,
want
it's
that.
the same in China, right? And in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, I think, of course, like, yeah, like I'm not going to dispute the fact that, okay, yeah, like they raised was a couple 100 million people from extreme poverty. But
Yeah.
but if you actually look between the lines in those claims, it's that like they lifted a lot of people from extreme poverty to like slightly less extreme poverty.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then, you get these like leftists who never look at, what does it actually mean, right? That you're
yeah.
lifting people from
How
extreme
do you
poverty.
define poverty? I mean, I've talked about this a lot in China.
Right.
The poverty rate is the countrywide poverty rate is $400 a year. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
obviously you're gonna lift
Right.
people out of poverty if that's what your marker is. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that, you know, China doesn't really have as much of this stuff as a lot of people tend to think. But Hong Kong to me definitely seems like it has even less. I don't know, like at least the Chinese government, you know, builds housing for people and stuff like that. You know, obviously with strings attached. But China, it's like, I mean, in Hong Kong, it's like, you know, at least to me as someone on the outside looking in, watching all, someone like me is just going to see the worst of it.
Mhm.
People living in like the absolute, like I've never seen housing anywhere in the world as bad as in Hong Kong. Like it seems even worse than like a shantytown, the way lots of people there live, and they live in actual apartment buildings. I don't know, like
Yeah, they're like subdivided flats and stuff. Yeah, that's what they're typically
yeah,
called. Yeah. I mean, I think it was like 1 out of 5 people live under the poverty line or something. And most of I mean, the kind of trippy thing is most of these, I mean, it's not that trippy. It's literally, it's very neoliberal. It's like, right. It's like these shoebox buildings are like quite literally next to like giant shopping malls sometimes. Right.
yeah,
And yeah, so it's yeah, that's kind of the reality. Again, I want to say, I live in a very very shitty country in the United States, and we have our own privileges too. But like in terms of healthcare and stuff, like it's like that's also like extremely terrible. So it's like I think but it's kind of like yeah, no, it's a particularly kind of precarious condition in Hong Kong. It's very inequitable, and I guess I'm just trying. I'm hesitating to try to compare like which place is worse or something
yeah.
too
I
much. But I
mean,
think it's the same
maybe
kind of
like
policies.
Singapore would be a good place, but I don't really know much about Singapore.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah. So I usually just caution
But I
away
mean,
from.
no, Singapore actually is a really good comparison because in Singapore, the government, you know, even though they're really authoritarian, really capitalist, the government owns almost all the housing in Singapore and allocates it to people. So that would probably be an improvement. I don't know, but like if even they can do it, like, you know, it's a very similar situation, very high density sort of city state place, kind of sort of similar culture, and it's complete opposite approach to housing, especially for example. Kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, we have an article on this too in Lausan, but like the real estate tycoons really run a lot of the same
Yeah, and I'm sure
families
they
or
vote
something.
as well.
Yeah. Well, the frustrating thing is like some of them are pro, some of them are like secretly or subtly pro opposition, but
Mhm.
obviously if there's like a bit of pressure they cave in. But like but
Yeah.
it's like they do win some weird following
Yeah,
among
well, I
some.
mean, if anything is going to change through the current system, even just a little bit, obviously the prerequisite for that would be the people that actually be able to vote. So yeah.
Yeah. Right. Definitely. Yeah.
So one thing that
Um,
we should cover as well, to completely change the subject
mhm.
again, um, what do you think of like I don't know? I feel like these people are an incredible minority. You know, the sort of as you call them. I don't like the word tankies, but you know, gray zone sort of people. Like I feel like in real
This.
life, these people like you could invite 500 people from your neighborhood and ask any of them if they've ever heard of the gray zone. All of them would say no. But online, it's
Yeah.
like fucking everywhere,
It's such a
dude.
mess. Yeah.
So I don't know. What do you think about them? What do you think about this sort
I have a
of
lot of
trend
thoughts.
to just oppose anything that is against the, or at least on the surface seems to be against the USA?
Right. Yeah. Wow. I have a lot of thoughts, as some people can see on my Twitter feed. It's been plaguing my mind every day. But yeah, no, it's disgusting. It's terrible. It's fascistic. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. Again, I've led with this question because I've been asked about tankies so many times and over the course of the past years is like, what right do these people have to judge how people fight for their own liberation? Like, it's a genuine question for me to them. Like, when do you think people have the right to protest, right? Like, and why do you think you reserve the right to tell a group of people how they should protest, right? And obviously, like as leftists, there's things we disagree with, like don't get like NAD funding or CIA funding or something, right? But like who are you to say, right, these people to judge these people on the basis of like, whatever. So it's like, how pure do you want them to be, right? Mm-hmm. For them to match what criteria of liberation looks like. And I think a big part for me is what's the alternative, right? So you say like, okay, yeah,
I think it's pretty natural. I think it's pretty natural for people to like, when they're under the boot of one superpower, to just go to the other. That's like
speaking as a leftist, as an activist and an organizer, right? For example, so you get like some like working class person in Hong Kong. So it's like you have dissatisfaction with your government or something. That what are you supposed to, like, according to these tankies, is that you have no right to oppose your government in any way. I mean, I'm sure all these people have tried all the conventional means of trying to raise dissent in a peaceful way, right? That's why we have such a militant movement this year. It's been year and year of peaceable demands, right? Of people working within the system that have been consistently squashed. So what do you want them to do?
I mean, like any sort of realistic view at the protests and their goal shows that, I mean, most people in Hong Kong support, like, the actual, like, as I said, the universal suffrage and stuff like that. So,
right.
What are these people supposed to do beyond like ask for it, beyond going out and protesting and saying, please give us this thing? Like, are they supposed to just shut up and hope that China eventually says, "Oh, they've been so nice, they've been so quiet for so long. Let's give them the right to vote now." Yeah,
it's like it's not even like it's just a basic thing. It's like it's like if something doesn't. Yeah, I don't even know how to go into it, but it's such a basic thing. It's like obviously people aren't just randomly jumping into all these crazy tactics and stuff like that because they feel like it, or because the U.S. dictated them to, or something, right? Mm-hmm. It's a complicated history, right, of real experience of struggle, of disillusionment, right, that lead people to whatever conclusion they make. And as leftists and as activists, we think with the masses, we think with the struggle, and try to push for the most liberatory potentials and alternatives pragmatically, right? I think that's the thing we should do. It's not to just because people you don't like, right, is marching on you on the street next to you in the street on a dumb Trump rally, doesn't mean you're like, oh no, just kidding, I guess we're voting for Trump. It's like, no, that's not that's not how organizing works.
It's another good example. Like it's like, you have the BLM protests in the US, you have the people who attend the protests are like, oh, I hate all violence, I renounce all violence, these people are terrible rioters. And then you have people on the other side who are like, fuck this, let's destroy this country.
Yeah, and I dare say a lot of the people are the more liberal types who are still getting radicalized, and they're still like, this is not the soul of America or something, or why, and then it's like things that we just don't agree with as the left, right? But what are you gonna do? Like cancel these people? Like, what does that even mean, right? And this is exactly the type of thing you see in places like Hong Kong and Syria and stuff, right? Where I mean, the disinformation is so clear, and it's like they pick out a few flags and they. I mean, first of all, the thing I don't really get is, like, if you're actually like receiving U.S. funding and you're actually what these tankies think you are you really gonna go out and wave a U.S. flag? It's like that's just like that would be like the dumbest thing to do.
Well, to be honest, the stuff that I know about U.S. operations, I feel like they might actually recruit people that dumb, but.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but it's just so many of these evidences are just like total bullshit, right? I mean, it's like
an example of like one example for like in the Belarus protest recently, people were like circulating a picture on Twitter of some guy with a flag, like holding up a banner, and he said like "Free Hong Kong, free Iran, free Ecuador," and they're like, this guy clearly supports all U.S. imperialism. I'm like, do you see the? I'm just seeing that, and I'm just saying it's some guy who probably reads the news once a week, and he's just putting the names of countries that he heard about protesting on a fucking banner. Obviously.
Or, I mean, I know this from experience in Hong Kong. It's like, no, people just like, I literally see people doing this. It's like, you get like literally the same like 3 people with like, 30 American flags, and they just pass them out. You're like, no, just wave this, it'll get someone's attention. And people just take them and just wave a flag. So it's like, I would literally see that happen in front of my eyes, where it's just like, some guy's passing out shit, and I was like, oh, okay. It's like, it's like, what's the, I mean, you could critique that, obviously, right? But like sometimes it feels like these people have never been to protest before. It's like, yeah, the grass is always greener from the other side. Some guy probably knows nothing about U.S. imperialism or something. It's just like all he wants is like Like, give me the right to vote, right? Yeah, sure, give me a US flag, give me a Catalonia flag, whatever. You know, that literally happens. Like, there's like a bunch of different flags going on sometimes, right? But like, you know, they channel that as disinformation. It's like, oh, okay, two people met with the US diplomat, therefore the whole movement's canceled. I mean, obviously, I mean, I always need to address this point because, you know, this is not only tankies, right? But like pro-Beijing, just like nationalists always bring up this, like, okay, what about that protester setting that guy on fire, right? Like, that's bad. Like, that's just don't set people on fire because of xenophobia.
Yeah.
It's like not good. Like, I don't know how else to, and people not even like a leftist like me have said that, right? Like, they condemn that type of xenophobic violence, right? But they still use these instances to somehow justify and weaponize these things to ignore, you know, cops gassing the whole city and the things like that. And I think that's the point where I don't understand, right? And so like, what are we supposed to do when like China openly backs the U.S. on certain things? And historically, like U.S.-China collusion is like frequent, right? And from East Pakistan to Chile, I think. I mean, what are you supposed to not talk about that? I think that's
at least to me, I mean, it seems like there's sort of differences, performative mostly, and in terms of basically just trade wars. In terms of security collusion, there is quite a bit, especially when they have shared interests in other countries.
I think the point I feel like is usually more lacking in the discourse is, you know, I think they always like to phrase it as like oh, you know, leftists like me or something are you know, if we're not actually straight up CIA agents or something, we're just extremely naive, and or this whole like neither China, the Beijing or Washington thing just literally serves the interests of Washington. I mean, like, but actually, like, my point of view is actually like they're the ones who's doing a selective critique of U.S. imperialism, right? I mean, I could name examples after example, right? Like that you've already talked about. U.S. training the Hong Kong police, the NED actually giving funding to pro-Beijing groups before and held workshops for them. You know, China, you know, and adopting U.S. technology and surveillance firms and all that stuff for Xinjiang surveillance. I mean, literally black water, which is the worst thing ever, like one of the worst things ever now. And then, yeah, it's like all these things they say is, you know, but they're like, oh, and okay, they say something like, oh, yeah, but these things are not threatening national security. But security for whom? It's like these things are literally used by the Chinese government to take away security, right? For their own people, and it's active collusion with U.S. interests, right? You know, like I think you know, I always refer people to read you know, this economist called Patrick Bond, who pointed out the fact that, you know, China has gained power and gained voting shares on the IMF, right, in expense of a lot of countries in global South, like Nigeria and stuff, that actually lost voting shares and power as China rose to this kind of level where it could kind of do this inter-imperial collusion thing in these literal, you know, the worst international financial organs, right, that we see, the IMF and the fact that these tankies are not they're totally ignoring it. To me, that's the total it's a selective criticism, right?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of treat China as like a vulnerable victim or something, as if it's not like basically about to become, you know, maybe like 10-20 years it's going to be the world's biggest economy, and it's a global superpower. It's, you know, they don't really need you arguing on Twitter to defend them.
Yeah. Yeah. But as kind of ridiculous as it sounds, it's a big problem for the left, right? I would say it's one of the biggest problems the left has to face in terms of international solidarity. I mean, the simple reason isn't that, you know, obviously, like you said, like these people are pretty marginal, or they're like very concentrated in very specific spaces, like anti-war working groups, or, you know, Answer Coalition or something, right? Like the same few groups. But I think the problem with these narratives isn't that, like, you know, like, oh my God, like everyone's going to turn into tanky at a certain point. Like, that's not the fear. The fear is the fact that they churn out enough disinformation to muddy and neutralize the dialogue, right? To neutralize the discourse enough where, you know, say someone who doesn't know enough about Hong Kong doesn't know enough about Syria or Nicaragua or something, right? And they'd be like, and then they see these narratives and they're like, no, okay, it seems like their protesting seems legit, but, you know, there's also this side, so I don't know how to feel about it. Because that's all it takes, right? For one to put obstacles and to work against international solidarity. It just takes inaction. It just takes confusion, right? In the general discourse. I'm not questioning like the intelligence of people who read these things, but, you know, there's so much going on, right? And the fact that these people are churning out these disinformation, like, that's going to muddy the dialogue. If I don't know anything about, you know, Syria or something, and all I see, or a lot of what I see, is like gray zone, right? Then I think I don't need to fully buy into gray zone, right? To not do international solidarity, not give the support I'm supposed to give as a leftist, as an anti-imperialist. So I think that's actually the biggest problem, right? It muddies the dialogue, and that's enough for their work to be effective. Sadly,
yeah. I mean, I just like taking a look at gray zones, Hong Kong, like Hong Kong coverage right now. For example, this title is "Behind a Made-for-TV Hong Kong protest narrative, Washington is backing nativism and mob violence." It's like
it's all like what, Dan Cohen or something. Like,
yeah, of course that's him. I don't know, but
like,
I mean, he's like they're doing like what we've been talking about this whole time. Like they're taking like the absolute worst elements of the protests and putting them on the screen. Which, I mean, this is exactly what he's accusing the other side of doing in the title, basically, just from the other end.
Exactly. Yeah, they parachute down into a place that they know nothing about. And yeah, I guess so. I mean, I love being on record saying fuck, Ben Norton and Dan Cohen specifically, right? And Max Blumenthal and all these people. Because
it's a matter of time until they start calling Thailand's monarchy like an anti-imperialist monarchy, because there's protests against it, and some of the people in the protests like paid by the NED. So
right, and they just parachute in, and every time there's a new hot topic, and just educate like Westerners supposedly on behalf of those people. And yeah, anyways, I can go on about how shitty these people are. But before, I mean, I do want to offer a point of not it's not just like I'm trashing the tankies, but on the note of like, yeah, so I think one of the other bigger problems with them, right, that I mentioned earlier, is the fact that there's no alternatives, right? Like there's no productive or positive answer besides like we have to protect some authoritarian government, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff going on the ground, right? That posits an alternative to left international solidarity that these people are actively not pursuing. For example, like there's like the End Forced Uyghur Labor campaign that's going on right now in like London during London Fashion Week. And I think was it Model Alliance or something who's doing a similar thing in like a New York version of it or something, where they're trying to hold accountable companies that take Uyghur labor or something. And there's like, I think these are things where you actually connect, you talk about transnational issues, right, on a very rooted local level, right? I think, and I'm going to say this like again in some other talk next week, but like I think one thing that I thought was really like just like really productive and really important was like if you go to the website of that like Enforced Uyghur Labor Solidarity Campaign thing, like they have a little blurb at the end where they're like, because they're specifically targeting Zara, right, on this instance. But they have a little blurb in the end where it's like, it's like, oh, if you're a Zara worker, like contact us like anonymously. It's like we'll work with you if you want to fight your bosses too or something. I think that's precisely the type of productive, positive left energy or work that needs to be done, right? Literally connecting, like, so that China isn't an abstract issue. It's an issue you fight for in the doors of Zara, in the doors of H&M, right? With people in your local community, with workers. I think that's actually the way to do international solidarity as the left.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it bothers me how there's like, there's definitely like the specter in the West of China as the big bad, just like China, and that's about the extent of people's understanding of it.
Right.
And like,
yeah,
but I mean,
the fear mongering is real about China and how people quickly, I think there's a kind of yellow pearl element thing channeled, right? Definitely, I think.
I mean, personally, I think China is at least outside of its own backyard. It doesn't really do it doesn't really do anything near as destructive as the US, for example. But that doesn't mean that. But I mean, that's a pretty low bar. Come on, still.
That was a very low bar, yeah. Yeah, but for me, it's more like it's bad enough, I think, as the left. What does it mean that they're starting to adopt those methods, right? What does it mean they're literally getting U.S. police funding? Like things like that, right? Where it's like, like to simply put, people are always like, you critique China, it's like, but U.S. is even worse or something, right? But it's like, are we really gonna not act until things get as bad as like the U.S. or something before we organize? Like that's not how. It's not like things aren't as bad as the most terrible imperial nation in the world history or something. Like then we're not going to do anything. That's not how you organize. It's like you try to counter it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always I hate the comparisons to the US. Like it's like, for example, if I criticize social programs in China, for example, people will say, well, it's better than the US. Well, yeah, obviously, no shit.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, so we shouldn't do anything? Is that like you're gonna tell a person who who has trouble with healthcare in China to not. It's like, no, it's like, at least it's worse over there. So just be quiet. Like, is that really?
I mean, I think that does. There was a tweet
Yeah.
that I saw recently from someone in Lausan, I believe. I can't pronounce the name properly, and it was something like a lot of these people are just like they basically compare everything to the US, and they believe that the US is like this massive global manipulator that controls absolutely everything. Which, I mean, it is a global manipulator, but not to the extent that they think. And that's just kind of like another expression of American exceptionalism, just because they basically internalized the narrative of people who think that America does those things and it's good, and now they believe that America does those things and it's bad. So.
Yeah, it's there's no critical thinking. Yeah, it's racist in its own way, and like it's kind of weirdly Orientalist or exoticizing in a very problematic way. And I think, and the fact that a lot of it's taken up by white folks and diaspora people of color, leftists, right? I think it speaks a lot to this phenomenon, right? This kind of overcompensation, right, of needing to oppose US above all else because of all the legitimately terrible shit we see here and we face. And then you somehow, that means you suspend thinking and I mean,
in a way I understand how people get to that point, because if I saw someone talking about the Uyghur camps, for example, every single day, and they never say a single word about what we just found out was happening like this week or last week with the people's fucking literal uteruses being removed in concentration camps in the USA,
right?
It's obvious that this is just like a purely like partisan issue for them. It's like a geopolitical issue. It's nothing more than that. And that really that bothers me. I call people out about that all the time, but it's like, as you said, that some people see that and they overcompensate to it's happening here, but it's not happening there.
Right. And that's not, and I think to me, there's literally a continuity, right? It's not like these things are, it's not like, there's this wholly different system thing and like you analyze it and they're like not as bad, right? It's literally the same types of methods, right? We live in a global order.
They learn from each other.
Yeah, they learn from each other, and we live in a global system that's wrought by Western imperialism, and what we're looking at is different state agents, different political actors taking up a same. It's still the same fight of fighting against imperialism, right? It's just fighting against the legacy of the West and the West, right? That's still prominent, right? But it's kind of it's like extending itself, where it's being kind of co-opted, right, by these other actors. And I think as the left, it's not replaced it's not like if China uses these policing methods, it's fine. It's like, no, it's like, if to be truly against, right, Western imperialism, we strike at the root, we strike at every extension it can have, and we try to stop it from spreading. We stop it from we stop other countries or states or other actors from taking on the same destructive methods that we all know very well, right, living in the imperial core. So that's my attitude towards tanky. It's not about which one's worse. So.
Well, I think we need a new insult, because I don't like the word tanky. But anyway, I identify as a little bit of a tanky. It hurts me. I think it's just kind of lame. I don't know. But so anyway, we should finish up here. But before that, maybe we can take some questions from the chat. I'll read them to you. If anyone has a question for Promise, which is a great name, by the way, much better than mine, let us know.
I don't know. Wish I had a more normal name sometimes. Yeah, but
I mean, it's my name is George, dude. It's terrible. It's in my own brain. I'm George Costanza. I can't say it. Constanza. I can't. George Constance. That's the translation. Rohan Baymak asks, do you have any suggestions for books to read about Chinese imperialism? I mean, you could read Lausan's website, I guess.
There's that. I think I'm trying to think what I always recommend a good friend, Aolong Yu. I could spell that or whatever. Yeah, it's like he has a book called China's Rise. That was like published a decade back, and that's pretty useful. And of course, honestly, most basic Chinese history books touch on both the positive legacies, right, of the so-called Maoist revolution and the Chinese state, and also the negative legacies, right? So I think honestly, I would literally just say if you just read objectively and read widely, right, about the stuff that people put their like scholars wrote, right, that they spend a lot of time researching. For the most part, you can't come away right with any of that stuff and be like, no, China's perfect. It's fine. It's like it's really out there, right? And I think yeah, I just encourage people to read. I mean, Morris Meisner is another one. It's called like Mao's China and Now or something. I forgot, but that covers everything from Mao to like when Deng Xiaoping started stripping away all the social protections and portraying the working class and stuff.
Someone asked another good question. Sorry. Nathan Drake said he used to know some HKers and many of them expressed xenophobic attitudes towards mainlanders. Right. How do you navigate around that while supporting self-determination for HK?
Yep, that's the big question. Yeah, that's our whole fight, and that's the fight we've been having. I mean, yeah, self-admittedly, yeah, there's a lot of xenophobia, right? I mean, and I don't think this is the. I mean, you can talk about why that is or where that came from, right? And how that I think people don't distinguish between like there's a legitimate criticism, right, of like mainland investment, like business people like gentrifying areas in Hong Kong, and then there's like poor mainland immigrants who are just being widely kind of like people are charged. It's like the same rhetoric we see here, right? That's super right wing.
It sounds like something that could be remedied by class consciousness, really, which doesn't sound like there's much of it.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole that's been the left's answer in Hong Kong for every generation, right? Again, right? It's as organizing goes, it's never about just what's right. It's about how you can bring what you think is right to a larger consciousness, right? And unfortunately, it's we've been talking about class, we've been talking about cross-border solidarity, we've been talking about the mainland thing for every generation before me. Like we're not the first people to do it in Lausan, and it's hard. And I think it's not just like, oh, Hong Kongers suck. It's like there are real limitations, and as the left, we find strategies to try to connect these things, right, in a way that that doesn't betray our principles, but like yeah, stuff like that. I mean, one thing is like, for example, I think this is why I think being abroad is a really important place, because there's huge opportunities for, because things are so tense on the ground in Hong Kong. Sometimes it's a little hard to make that kind of conversation, even as a mainlander, as a Hong Konger. And I think there's actually a lot of spaces, right, for student groups, for organizations, and for just like different networks and spaces, right, to cultivate these connections between Hong Kongers and mainlanders, right? And Hong Kongers pay attention to international stuff. They pay attention to what the diaspora is doing. And I think one work that Lausan's trying to do, right, is to keep influencing and keep bringing these people together, and for Hong Kongers and mainlanders to think together, right, and offer a vision of solidarity, right, that seems relatively foreclosed or is difficult to kind of achieve because of the tensions and the movement. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer, but I'll say that's something that we've been trying to do.
Profound questions.
Yeah, I mean, I try to.
It's like the anti-mainland sentiment. Is this something new, or has it always kind of been there?
I think it's pretty new. So I mean, we have to consider the fact that like there's always been a lot of obviously migration and back and forth, but like that kind of like was lessened, I think, in the kind of like final decades of British rule, right? And I think at least in my parents' generation, right, so much of it is there's actually we don't hear that much about the mainland, right, in a really close way, right? And I think it's I think it definitely grew, especially what I was talking about earlier with the umbrella revolution thing, right, where umbrella movement, where there's like a new thing in political discourse, right? Like, what does it mean to be a Hong Konger, right? That wasn't really a question. Again, that's why I kind of alluded to this history of the pan-democrats, right? Being, their ideological base is solidarity with mainland dissidents, right? It's kind of this liberal, universal human rights thing, right? But the fact that like that the failure of that strategy, right, or people seeing that as failure, has been conflated into prioritizing mainlanders too much doesn't work. It's actually counterintuitive. So
just taking the complete opposite message from it.
Yeah. So actually, for me, what I see is a false and very violent, right, and problematic conflation of a failure of a liberal democratic strategy, and a conflation between that and it's kind of solidarity with mainland dissidents, right? And I think that's not even dissidents, just like mainlanders, right? Because like so much of that's been kind of like tied together, right? I think a lot of people are like, you know, these old politicians spend so much time talking about China, but like they never spend enough time about Hong Kong now or something, right? And that's been a lot of the sentiment. And yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort to try to work against that based on, you know, yeah, the structure Hong Kongers are given, and also Hong Kongers' own internal racism, superior, whatever you call it, right? So I think that's real. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's give it one more question. I have to choose carefully. Okay, no, two more, because this one is really funny. And then one serious question, okay? Is there any belief in QAnon in Hong Kong?
You never know. I mean, there's a lot of like, you know, not an organized one for sure, but there's some, you know, there's always some weird people on some, like, you know, online platform. I mean, the thing about the Hong Kong movement, I mean, this also relates, also kind of partly answers that, is that so much of the discourse, and, you know, there's actually a lot of ideas floating around, right? That goes on in these Telegram channels and these like kind of very specific local forum apps and stuff, where you get like the most ridiculous shit that you can read. And yeah, sometimes it's that stuff. Sometimes it's some weird other conspiracy thing that somehow some guy managed to relate to the movement or something. And sometimes it's people arguing about Democrats, and yeah, it's you get all kinds of shit in the movement. Yeah, so I don't know exactly about that.
All right, so one more question. Okay, how about this one? Do you think that there will be anything like Tiananmen that could happen in Hong Kong realistically?
I generally don't think so. I think that's going to be a huge, like, that's going to be a little bit too much, I think, for the Beijing government. I think the closest,
I think they're not that stupid.
Yeah, I think the closest gotten to that point was the Polytechnic University siege, right? And the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Did anyone die there, or did they just get arrested and stuff?
No, I don't think there were deaths. There was like a lot of injuries and people trying to flee and getting injured, as far as I know, right? But yeah, that was huge, right? Because like they it was like a war zone for like a couple of days, and they surrounded the university, and I think Tiananmen started trending on Twitter, and people were trying to. It's like they actually felt like there's a real possibility that they'll just kind of like, you know, like barge in, and then obviously at the end they kept shooting tear gas and stuff like that, but like. Yeah, they didn't. But then I think that shows that I don't think that's kind of in their plans, at least for the near-term future, for example. But I do want to point the fact that, like, I think this was in beginning of this year, like late last year, where they released and they're doing the same thing again, I think, for Taiwan, the South China Sea. But they released a video, like basically a propaganda video of just like like their really hardcore military, like shooting missiles and invading Hong Kong. Like just like
really? Like the government did that?
Yeah, no, it was just like the People's Liberation Army, and they're like boasting about how we can. I mean, it's like they didn't say Hong Kong, but it was quite, you know, it's like you can tell it's like the city, and that's what they're talking about. And you just like missiles firing at Hong Kong, and then you get these like special forces people landing and like with machine guns and stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
and so like you have shit like that where like, you know, I think they released a similar thing like I think just a couple of days ago. I think this is near Guam or somewhere in South China Sea, I forgot, but like, you know, they tried to simulate what if US like did something there, and like this is how they would respond, and it's another flashy macho military video thing, right? So I'm not saying they're actually gonna do that, but like, you know, the fact that they're promoting this rhetoric of violence is already kind of and then not to mention the other kinds of violence that are already going on is pretty concerning. But yeah, I don't think, and I hope not, that another Tiananmen will happen, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's basically no chance. I don't think. I mean, I think that the Chinese government wants to maintain trade relations with the entire world, basically, and that's something that would obviously compromise them very badly.
Yeah, that would be a little bit too much, I think, even for Xi Jinping. Yeah. So
okay, so we can finish up here then. For people in the chat, I'm going to stay for like a couple minutes more to just answer questions, just to me. So yeah, and thank you very much, Promise.
Thanks for the invitation.
Really fun talking to you. And people can follow Promise Lee at PromiseLee _ on Twitter, and Lausan HK at Lausan HK on Twitter.
Yeah, just follow Lausan, you have to follow me. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, he doesn't want you to follow him. Please don't follow him.